Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining me. Today I'm with Gerardo again because as my podcast editor was working on the last episode, she sent me a message and she said, hey, if you guys both love Andor, why don't you talk about the accents specifically from that series? And I was like, of course, that's a great idea. And Gerardo accepted. So today we're going to take a bit more of a deep dive into how we perceive accents, what vibe we get from accents, and what we think about the characters based on how they speak. Because for me, that's just another universal thing that we see in Star Wars, the fact that we have biases around accents, even when robots and droids speak. So now let's get on with the show. I'm Bianca, your personal American accent coach, and I'm here to help you master an American accent in English because your voice is your choice when it comes to how you sound. I try to release a podcast episode every 2 weeks, and so you should really subscribe to whatever podcast platform you use so that you don't miss the newest episode. And by the way, if you want to see the full video of the episode, it's available at Accent Coach Bianca on YouTube. Now, let's get on with the show. Hey, welcome back, Gerardo. We're going to do our second episode. It was kind of a surprise. We didn't plan on it, but then we decided, oh yeah, let's do it. Let's talk a little bit more and more specifically about Andor, which is a spin-off series, or it's a series in Star Wars. And I wanted to say, for people who didn't get a chance to see the first part, then could you just introduce yourself again real quick?
Sure, totally. Thank you, Bianca. So, well, I'm glad to be here again. It's always nice to discuss about topics that are passionate to you. I am Gerardo. I live in Mexico. I have a wife and a very beautiful daughter. We also have 2 dogs, 2 pugs. And, well, as I was saying last time, I am a super fan of sagas such as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, and Harry Potter. In fact, today, these 2 guys are joining me. We have
Perfect.
BB-8.
Nice. Oh, and this actually is perfect for what we're talking about today. For people who don't know these 2 characters, maybe you can just kind of describe the role they play and maybe the one that's missing, which is related to Andor. So give us a little clue about who these guys are, and maybe that can start us off talking about accents.
Yeah, so basically, I think that when they were producing the Star Wars universe, they were thinking about the droids as some kind of, like tension release. They are like funny characters during tension scenes, and they will do stuff that make you laugh, even though they seem tense and super creepy, right? So
we call that comic relief. So that makes sense, right? Like you're saying, relieve the tension. They're comical, they're funny. In English, we would just say they're comic relief, just so.
Comic relief.
So that's actually a phrase.
You got it. Got it. That's what I'm trying to say. And basically, as we know, these 2 droids, they don't speak in a language that people can understand. We already discussed about them in the last episode. They use some form of binary languages, right? That actually, very institutionalized. You can find translators online for the beeps and sounds that they can use so that you write something that you want to say, and it will give you the translation to their beeps and sounds. That's super cool.
That's perfect. And what I forgot was, can you hold them up again? Because what I forgot to say, remember, we can see these podcasts on YouTube. We can see the video. But for people who are listening, we have to describe what you're holding up. So tell me the names of these 2 replicas, I guess, toys of droids that you've got. You've got 2 of them. Can you tell us what are their names? So for people who are listening and can't see what we're looking at.
Sure, let's do that. So this is R2-D2. That's like the droids in the Star Wars universe are referenced with codes, but people give them like a fun name to call them. So most people in the movies will call this guy R2, only R2, like Arthur. And this guy is BB-8. They will normally call him, a BB-8. I don't remember if I heard the name like just BB, but I think that they use it in a couple scenes, just BB. So yeah, these 2 guys have been in lots of TV series, animated, and movies and whatnot. So yeah, you can see them everywhere in also merchandise. And they are really cool,
Yeah. Can I ask you too, maybe pop quiz, I guess, since we're talking about Andor today, and we're talking about accents and perceptions and how people or droids speak, who's missing from your collection? What's the famous droid, I would say, from the Andor series?
Yeah, the most famous droid from Andor series would be K2. Yeah, K2. So K2 starts, actually in the Andor series, starts as a battle droid from the Imperial, army. And it's supposed to be very well crafted droid that it's like able to outpower any other soldier. So they are super difficult for rebels to get rid of. So what happens is in one scene in Andor, basically they are able to crush it with a tank. It gets shut down. So
Hmm.
they get in on board one of their vessels and then they reprogram this droid. And that's why we see this droid during the Rogue One movie. That's how it's
Uh-huh.
going to be.
Yeah, exactly. And I think earlier in the Andor season two, this is the same model of droid that ends up catching Cassian Andor, the main character, and taking him off to like prison, right? So that's one that I was thinking. Actually, the one that I'm thinking of, which is one of my favorite droids, and I think totally underrated, is the little red one. It's like a little box, and it's funny that you mentioned the BB-8 because it's also B. It starts with B, and they just call him B all the time. And I think maybe you mentioned this in relation to our main character today is Cassian Andor in the series Andor, and you mentioned like, oh yes, he sticks around the mother figure of Cassian. And what I wanted to say about that is that if you guys ever watch this series Andor, pay attention to this droid, I think, because specifically of how it speaks. When it's speaking in English, when it's interacting with Cassian or the mother or lots of other characters in that area, then the droid itself has this voice that's very childlike. It's very like, if I were to imagine a puppy dog face, and it's like, Cassian, when are you coming home? Cassian, I want to talk to you. And he's often maybe not complaining, but wanting your attention in a way. It has a hard time lying. It says it takes a lot of its energy and data to lie. It's very effortful in that way. And it reminds me very much of a child. I don't know if you got that impression from this droid, but literally the way it speaks gives me the perception of, oh my gosh, it's a child, you know?
Yeah, totally, totally. It's a combination between like a child and I don't know, maybe something like a pet a little bit because he's very attached to the people he lives with Andor and with Marva. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's kind of the feeling that I get from him.
Yeah, and even like we said, like when you're coming home, like a pet, and it's to the extent that even when other people outside the family are interacting with this kind of household droid, like you even see people change how they speak to the droid, and they're like, it's okay, it's just going to be for a short time, the same way we would try to kind of placate a child. And I know you have a daughter too. We talked last time about voices and how we change our voices. So I thought, wow, here's a droid who has a voice and we perceive it in such a way that we alter how we speak to it too. So I thought
Yeah,
that was worth mentioning, in our conversation of
so
droids, but
true, so
that could be
true.
a whole nother episode. So speaking of Cassian, who's our main character, let's talk about him, where he's from, his home planet, where we meet him as an adult, where Marva, like you said, the mother figure, is still with him, and that place too. So maybe you can tell us about the names of the planets that they're from and any kind of sense that you get from how they speak, from their accent. Like, what does that help us to perceive? What are your thoughts on that?
So, going a little bit back to the origins of story of Andor in the series, we
Mm-hmm.
heard that he is from a planet called Canary, right? And when
Mm-hmm.
you see scenes from that, you see that it's more like a jungle-based planet, and people there will be like very, I don't know, it will give you the feeling that they are like a tribes, right? They are like tribes
Mm-hmm.
and they don't have a lot of technology. In some scenes, you see them using sticks and stones. So they are a very primitive civilization, if you will. But Star Wars uses that topic a lot throughout their saga, throughout their lore. Basically, heroes that come from humble beginnings. Basically, you see something similar with Anakin Skywalker. The first time you meet him, he's a slave.
Yeah, he's a slave. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's part of his character, right? He was owned by somebody else.
Yes,
I think his mother was owned, right? And therefore there was kind of like a package
exactly.
deal, let's say, right? Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
yes. It's
Mm-hmm.
owned by
Mm-hmm.
Watto. And
Yeah.
Watto actually doesn't speak. He speaks a couple languages. You hear him speak with Anakin in a different language than they use when they are speaking to the heroes, Obi-Wan
Mm-hmm.
Kenobi and the other guys.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you've heard them speak the language that's mostly used in the planet Tatooine.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
you can hear other characters like Watto, or like the people that selling things in the street market. They are using
Mm-hmm.
that language
Mm-hmm.
too. The reason that I wanted to discuss that, now that we're talking about accents and languages, is because in those scenes you get the feeling that the way that they speak, the way they move, their body language and all that, is like they were raised in the streets. They don't have a, like higher education that you
Mm-hmm.
see in
Mm-hmm.
scenes from other planets like Chandrila, right? So that's like the contrast that I wanted to talk about. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that reminds me of, I'm trying to think of a way to put it, privilege, right? And often we say, I don't know if there's a lot of data out there. I don't know if this number is correct, but like, oh, only 25% of Americans even have a passport, right? And so a lot of people who live in the United States, they only speak English, right? Maybe they took some language classes in school, but they don't need it, so they don't use it, right? It's kind of isolated in a way. And often some people with a prejudice, they might think, oh, you speak multiple languages. That's almost a signal that somebody had to, right? Like you said, in the market, like we think like, oh, well, there was lots of languages around. And so that can be this prejudicial signal in some way, right? Which is ridiculous because having more than one language, makes you richer and better. And we know it helps with our brain and things like that. But yet these things persist. So if we see a character who is almost proud of only speaking one language, we can say, oh, they must have some kind of privilege where they don't need to speak more than one language. At least that's kind of like a stereotype I feel like we get. Does that make sense how I'm trying to describe it?
Yeah, totally, totally. So the privilege gives you a way of thinking that, sometimes, expresses in the way that you actually speak, the accent you use and the way that you use it towards others. So yeah, that can totally happen. And for example, people that come from more humble beginnings, sometimes the way they speak is like kinder, if you will, like, more like you can feel it like friendlier sometimes. And besides when people that's like super entitled and they will speak like they don't deserve you, right? That's what I'm trying to
Oh,
say.
yeah. Yeah, we can use language and accent and dialect, and we can use all of those things to connect with people or to kind of push them away, right? And like put them in their place in a way. And we've used language for centuries now to kind of marginalize people and things like that. And I think most of the world is getting better at not being so racist in terms of like skin color or religion and things like that. But I feel like language is one of those last holdouts where we still see a lot of prejudice, around this. For example, if we go back to like Cassian, when he's a child and he's on Kenari and you hear their indigenous language and, you pick something up, you have these perceptions. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, later on, we never see anybody else from Kenari, right? As an adult. So we can't tell, is that Cassian's just his idiolect, like his way of speaking, or is that his Kenari accent, right? Because there's Kenari, his home planet, and then there's Ferrix, the planet where we see him, as an adult. So I don't know. Did you ever notice there were any other people from Kenari who were alive and grew up and they could kind of speak together? I don't think that happened in the series, right?
Yes. That's actually probably one of the greatest, things that people miss in the Andor series, because when you see Andor in Canary and you see him interacting with his sister, right? And he comes from a family, they, end up orphaned, and he's with his sister. And later on in the series, they never reveal what happened to his sister. That's one of the greatest misses.
Yeah.
And there were theories that maybe other people in the show could be from Canary, but not really. They don't go too deep into that. Yeah, the whole point is, I think that's one of the greatest misses on the show. But true.
Yeah. She survives. She gets out. He's looking for her, but we never find her, right? And
Exactly.
then his attention gets turned away to other things, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. And then, so I don't know if he grew up all on Ferrix or he was moving around or whatever, but let's talk about Ferrix, the planet now, because that to me, when I'm thinking of the Empire, when I'm thinking of imperialism, my brain goes to British versus American, right? And I think of, like imperialization of, before the US had its independence. And I often think like going back to humility and being humble, like there's a working class kind of vibe that I'm getting from Ferrix, and also the way that they speak very plainly to me in a more of an American accent than like a British one or something like that. So I feel like there's an accent of Ferrix as well. I don't know if that's true for you, but that's how I picked it up.
No, that's totally true. And that happens, sadly, that's happened throughout history because when a country or a nation is like the conqueror, and then they go and they conquer other peoples, you see, and basically the cultures start mixing, right? But there's always like that kind of feeling that there's a master and a slave. For example, Mexico lived under Spanish occupation for about 300 years, right? From the 1500s all the way through the 1810, which was the start of the Mexican Independence War. And at that point, a lot of things had happened. A lot of languages were crushed, like indigenous languages, they disappeared. Some others were kept, by some people that had been hiding from the Spanish somehow. And that's how you keep the culture going. So yeah, the way that stories like Star Wars and other stories depict this, sometimes they do that in a smaller scale, but you can still feel that Ferrix being like a factory for the Empire. And people there will be like, using slang, and they will, carrying the wrenches and all that with them, you see?
Yeah, and everything's dirty, right? And
Yes.
and you get this sense of, speaking of colonialization too, I'm thinking of like back in the Industrial Revolution, right? And when like we started to have machines and everyone went to a factory, and how that changed the landscape. It changed how people interact and social classes, and who could move up and down between social
True.
classes, and how do you sound, and how does that relate to your class, and what does that mean for upward mobility? I feel like Star Wars, if I'm not going too far, Star Wars is like a way to tell the story of human people kind of in a way that's outside, but like you just said, in a way that it can be very small and very impactful, right? Because it's so small and it's such a universal thing that's happened to a lot of us. It's just like, I don't know, I feel like we can all kind of connect in some way. We all feel something in there too. Yeah. And also, speaking of like, maybe not colonialization, but war, at least, right? This is another universal theme. Let's talk about the planet of Gorman, because I didn't know this when I first watched it, but there's I don't want to say accent, it's a language there. It's called Gore. And I didn't know this before, but this conlang, this constructed language, it was based on French. And then when I watched the series again, I had this really intense feeling of like, rebellion, resistance. I'm thinking of World War II, the French resistance, this kind of like underground plan to kind of usurp and overthrow this larger power. And if you listen to the language of Gore, you do get this sense, at least I did. Tell me if this is true for you. I got a sense of like the consonants, the vowels, the intonation, the rhythm. Like later I could say, oh yes, I can see how it's kind of based on French. Yeah. And like maybe there's something to that too, right? Because this planet is where all the like finest clothing are made. And I'm thinking World War II, France, resistance, fashion. To me, it all kind of goes together and it makes perfect sense. So, I mean, we're talking about perceptions and languages in Andor, in the world building of that. And so tell me what your thoughts are on the Gore whole language and accent.
Yeah. So the Gore language is like very, could say like good French is like they drag some of the syllables, some of the letters, they drag them, and they sound very Frenchy, like you're saying. And also it gives you like the vibes that some movies where there's this Nazi regime which in
Yep.
this case is the imperial occupation,
Mm-hmm.
and you have the resistance cooking up, right? Like, for example, in the movie Inglourious Bastards, you see a lot of combination of languages. You see French, you see German, you see English, you see Italian, and you
Yeah.
can see all the cultural richness and imbuing in what you are watching. Definitely, the gore gives you that kind of vibe, and it had to, because in what Star Wars tries to tell us is like one of the worst calamities that happen to good people, if we can say, like at least people that's under an occupation and under a regime, and ultimately the empire pushes, like they push the people to rebel. They are doing
Mm-hmm.
that on purpose, so they rebel and they can get rid of them because they have to drain the planet of natural resources that sadly were found on that planet.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. It's like, wow, this is a cycle. It's kind of a never-ending cycle, right? It's about resources. It's about using up something that's not yours or getting your hands on it, right? And we see that time and again, like,
Exactly.
oh, we just talked about the Canary thing, the planet wiped out, basically wiped out. There must have been a reason. They wanted it for what? For a base. They wanted, who knows, the trees in the jungle.
Right.
And then you think, oh, that sounds a lot like the Amazon. Like all these things just keep kind of coming up, right? And speaking of, how should we put it? Here's a group of people and they sound like this, and that gives me certain perceptions. I think if we go back to another famous character, I'm thinking of Jabba the Hutt, and
Sure.
how the speech like just gives you a certain feeling, right? Like, I don't know if you have something to say about that kind of language and how it feels, but I feel like they're related.
Yes, yes, totally. So Java the Hutt speaks Huttese, right? And it's a language that's mostly used by, characters from the same species as Java the Hutt is, the Hutts. And basically, they are like the gangsters, like the top guys in the gangsters
Mm-hmm.
and gangsters circle. And they are the mafia in Star Wars. And basically, they control everything about what's illegal, like smuggling stuff and drugs and all that. And basically, you can feel that vibe when they are speaking, even though it's a fictional language and it's very strong and very imposing. They always make you feel that they are imposing. You should be afraid of them because of what they can do to you if you don't comply, right? That's the feeling that I get from the Huts in general, and Jabba the Hutt being like the greatest of them all.
Exactly. And the most well known too. And I think if we don't even understand the words, right? This language was made up for a people that don't exist, right? But we know that they have a purpose as characters. And part of that is like how they make us feel and other characters feel. And when you listen to Jabba the Hutt and when he makes demands and when they're not optional, it seems like, right? And there's something in his voice. It's so interesting to me, as this is my job, right? I work with accents. I work with how do people perceive you, and not just what you're saying, but how you say it, not just clarity, but like, what kind of a voice are you using? What vibes are you giving off here, whether you know it or not? A lot of things we wouldn't know. For example, maybe we can keep the same theme, but switch kind of languages because, I live in Mexico. I've been here for a few years now, but I know there's all these subtleties that I don't even see. I don't even hear them because A, there's just a lot of different kinds of Spanish, and B, I don't know the history or the politics maybe around certain things or that legacy like we meant, right? So in Mexico, maybe you can tell me, like, now we're outside of Star Wars, we're here kind of in the present, thinking about how the past influences that and how people speak. Do you ever get the sense of when you hear how people speak, maybe it's people with a slight French accent because there was some French in the history, or Spanish from Spain, right? And how does that kind of like make you feel? Do you ever have any reactions to that? And also like indigenous languages, since we talked about that, like what are you being, Mexican from here, and I can't pick up on these things. Can you maybe explain if there's anything to that?
Yeah, yeah. So what I can say about that is when a nation starts becoming like very, what's the word in English? What's the word for many languages, like many different
Like
kinds
maybe
of people?
multicultural or
Yeah,
multilingual, maybe?
but there's like
Oh, I think I know what you're saying. A melting pot. There's a phrase. We call it the melting pot. When lots of cultures or immigrants come in and everything kind of mixes together, we call that a melting pot,
melting
right?
pot.
That's the phrase you're thinking of.
I'm trying to find a different word, but it's okay. It's okay. So
Okay,
basically, it's multicultural accents start sprawling everywhere around, and
right.
also people start using words, borrowed from the languages or from the people that you are, interacting with. Right after the Mexico got the independence from Spain, which made us speak Spanish everywhere in Mexico, but you had the French occupation, and also you
Mhm.
had the Mexican American War. So that made Mexico and the language, get many words that are from those languages. For example, in Mexico, you can hear sometimes people say like voila when something is done, right? Even words that you don't even notice from those languages, like garage for the place where you park your car, or
Mhm.
another one that's boulevard, because boulevard is also used for some streets in certain cities, right? So those are words that you borrow from that. And if
Right.
we go to, well, the topic, which is Star Wars and touching these kinds of things, you also get that a lot in Star Wars. For example, there's a phrase they use, as easy as blasting miners of a Star Destroyer. That means that's super easy, that you can possibly miss something like that. They do that a lot in Star Wars, so it's very curious to hear those kinds of phrases when
Yeah.
you're watching that.
Yeah, like internally, so inside of Star Wars, you recognize, oh, here's some slang, right? It's slang that we've kind of invented for the world building. And it's so funny because even if you didn't know what this little creature is, oh, it's as easy as you already know it's set up. You're saying, here's a thing that's really easy. Even if you've never seen a Minox, even if you don't know Star Wars, even if you don't know blasting Minox off a destroyer and what that means, like you totally get it, right? Because that's
Yes,
communicating this reference. And I'm willing to bet, within the whole Star Wars universe, there's planets that don't know what Minox are, right? But they
sure.
still use this phrase, possibly, right? Because that's how language kind of moves around, and it moves
Exactly.
from people traveling to one place to another, and they bring their language with them and they bring their accents with them,
Yes.
So again, we find this like kind of universal theme, and do you feel like because of the history, because of the French occupation, because of the Spanish colonialization, because of the American influence, and we're still neighbors, right? We've got lots of slang that we use. And there's a word I want to introduce here, which is called code switching, right? Because a lot of people are bilingual and in Mexico, Spanish and English. And so we can easily kind of switch from one to the next. And one of my favorite characters in Andor is this main character called Luthen, right? And I feel like he has
Oh,
kind of two different personalities. So I don't know if you get that from how he speaks, but I think it really comes through in just the way he speaks and the perception that we get. So yeah, I don't tell me what you think about Luthen.
yeah, no, Luzen is a whole character. He's super important to the story in Andor, and he's such a great actor as Stellan Skarsgård. He's,
Mm-hmm.
amazing in the role. You can get exactly that, what you're saying, the switching code, the switching roles. When he's in his bazaar and he's selling stuff and he's talking to important people, politicians and stuff, he uses this wig and he looks,
Mm,
super tidy, and he
yeah.
speaks like, oh, yeah, of course, and with a very notorious way of speaking. Unlike when he's not using the wig and he's like super underground and he's like, things have to be done because the rebellion can crash if we don't, right? And you can hear him using big words and being, far less polite and more to the point, and communicating with certain body language too. So yeah, definitely
Mm-hmm.
Luthen is someone that gives you that code switching vibe in a very great manner.
And we all do that, right? So if we speak more than one language, or at least that's the goal is to be able to switch back and forth between languages. But what people often forget is that a lot of our accent, it's personality, it's perception, it shows power, right? There's all these things hidden under there that we can't see, which is kind of ironic, right? We don't see accents anyways, we hear them. But like, even if we're thinking about, and think about Luthen, who are a lot of his clients on this one planet we've got, which is also, I believe, an immigrant culture, not immigrant, but a culture that has had to change their ways to conform, is this culture of the Chandrillans, I would say. They're from another planet, but they now live on, I think, Coruscant. And so we see, it's super interesting to me because we see these Chandrillans and they must have had a language, but you never see anybody speaking in their old native language, right? Because they've assimilated now. And in order to kind of keep their position, I think they don't even use that language anymore. I don't know if that's something that you picked up on too, but it kind of struck me.
Yeah, that's totally true. So in Chandrilan story is they don't give you a lot of that. But in Andor, you see a little bit more of that when the wedding. There's a scene where they're having a wedding between Mon Mothma's daughter and the boy from this other politician. I don't remember the name. But basically, you get a lot of the Jews of the Chandrilan culture there that they have lost because of whatever happened, assimilation throughout the galaxy, and how important Chandrila is in the politics of the Star Wars universe. And senators come from that place because of the preparation they have and all that. And you don't get to see that much of their culture, but in this scene, you see a little bit more, and it's amazing.
Yeah. And even, I think even the father of the bride is making a toast, and he's kind of even, maybe not making fun of it, but saying something like, oh, and you older guys, you'll remember this too, right? Yeah, and it's about the language, it's about the culture, and how you don't see that with the younger generation anymore. And I think that's another story that is universal, where how we have people who sometimes go to another culture and they want a foothold, and so they kind of renounce some of the culture or some of the language, and then their kids end up not inheriting that, for better or for worse, whatever the parents think is right. And then often sometimes that's regrettable, So I thought that was a really interesting choice, I guess, to not really include that much except at the wedding ceremony, right? And they would say, like, I think it was like Tima Sagrona was like the cheers kind of thing that they would say. But we still, at least I didn't hear like full-fledged conversations. Yes, so I think people weren't even that conversant anymore, in this language. So
that's totally correct.
So interesting. And maybe we can end this today by me noticing, at least when I'm in Mexico and you go to some places, you can still see this kind of resurgence of pride of the indigenous cultures and language that comes up. You can go to bookshops in Oaxaca and you can get books in different, indigenous languages. Super interesting. And I've even noticed in Peru, there are some pop singers who are singing Quechua now and trying to like have this resurgence of some of these things too. So I really like how in Mexico, when I see this, I see it, to me, it's like, oh my gosh, so there's a pride there, right? We're not trying to bury that so much as maybe in other Latin American countries too, who were also colonized. So how it's been kind of like handled it's really interesting to me, like language and culture and history and things like that. So you being from here, I don't know, is there anything you wanted to add about having like this mix of French and colonialized Spanish and indigenous languages? Anything else that you wanted to like share that you notice?
Yeah, so just so that we wrap up this topic in that tenure, basically what I can say is, yes, the Spanish did a very good job trying to eliminate the indigenous culture in Mexico. And that was the case for, centuries. But in the latest decades, and that's what I wanted to highlight, in the latest decades, the indigenous culture has had super comeback. Like you can see more people now using indigenous themed shirts and clothing, speaking about their culture and, getting all kinds of handcrafted work from those people to their homes. So you see a lot of that in the latest decade. The culture has had a comeback like, not a day before.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, amazing because, I think a lot of, like you said, they did a great job, kind of erasing those things. I think that's part of like colonization and power, and sometimes is to try to get rid of this thing. And then later, a lot of people realize like, wow, there's so much value that we're losing from that, or knowledge or things like that. And can we try not to lose those things? So yeah, I think in terms of language and accent and identity, that's one of the things that I feel really strongly about, is the value behind the diversity, worldwide, and how, yeah, there's a lot of prejudice around that. We need to talk about it too. But the idea that like, oh, we can learn more. It's really interesting. Like such an interesting topic. So it's been perfect to have you come back today, talk about this again, even deeper with a more specific thing, because we just happened to realize last time that we both love this particular series. So it's been great to just, how should we say, bring it back up again, right? Yes, exactly. And it's not just human languages, we can say. It can be artificial languages, conlangs, binary languages, like you said, right? So I think, yeah, you're the perfect person to talk to. So I want to say thank you so much for coming today and talking about this with me.
Thank you. The same. And well, happy to come back. And bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Yes. Thank you, everybody, for listening all the way to the end. I like to share a little secret story about what's going on lately when you do that. And today, I want to kind of follow up on the last one, which was about scorpions in Mexico. And this time, I want to tell you about this kind of weird thing that's been happening. There's kind of a season for cockroaches here. And, keep the doors closed, things like that. Don't leave food out, obviously. And then there's baby cockroaches. And there's big cockroaches. And when I find in the morning dead cockroaches, just like belly up, and I find a whole bunch of them, sometimes every day, 4 or 5. And it's just kind of the season. And these cockroaches that are the big ones, that means they've stayed alive this long. And finally, they're not finding food and they can't. So I think the last thing that happens is they come out, they start looking for food, they can't find any, and they die. So luckily I'm not finding any small ones, because the small ones would say like, oh, they're still around. So this is a weird thing to tell you, I know, but it's like bug season right now where I live. And of course, as always, if you have any specific topic that you'd like to talk about, accents or pronunciation, let me know and I'll find a guest and I'll make it a reality. So hopefully I will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.